The maid's breath caught in her throat as she stepped inside. The room was dark, and an earthy smell mixed with something metallic hung in the air. She could just make out the floor, where eggshells, some intact, some shattered, were scattered in every direction. But these weren't ordinary eggs. Their shells shimmered faintly, with flecks of gold glinting under the faint light from the doorway. Some of the shells were streaked with colors she couldn't recognize, as if infused with jewels, or something even stranger. Her heart raced as she took in the bizarre sight, her skin prickling with an instinctive dread. She backed away, her eyes still glued to the scattered shells, but she froze as she heard footsteps outside. Her mistress was returning, and a chilling realization swept over her. If she were caught, the consequences could be deadly. In a quiet, isolated village where the mountains loomed dark and the rivers whispered old secrets, there was one house that stood above the rest, both in size and in mystery. Perched on a hillside overlooking the town, the house was grand, with ivy curling up its stone walls and windows that seemed to watch anyone who dared walk past. This was the home of the richest woman in the village, a woman known for her beauty, her coldness, and her unexplainable wealth. No one knew how she had come to possess so much money, and no one was bold enough to ask. She lived alone, with no husband, no family, only a single maid who seemed as quiet and withdrawn as her mistress. The townspeople were endlessly curious, yet deeply wary of this woman. It wasn't only her beauty that unnerved them, though she did look like something from a dream, with her dark hair that fell past her waist, her sharp eyes, and the way her clothes flowed around her like shadows. No, it was something more, a sense of the unnatural about her. It was said that she'd always been in the village, yet no one could remember her being young. Her face never seemed to change, and her pale skin never aged, as if the years themselves feared to touch her. Rumors floated around like autumn leaves, whispering of strange practices, secret rites, and riches that couldn't be earned by any normal means. Each day, the villagers saw her leaving her house in silence, slipping through the mist of dawn to go, where? No one knew. Some said she went to meet spirits in the woods. Others swore she communed with creatures of the night. All they knew was that she'd return hours later, her expression blank, but her hands clutching something wrapped in cloth, a mysterious bundle she never let anyone see. In the years since she first appeared, her wealth had only grown. There seemed no end to her fortune. She wore dresses finer than any the village had seen, silk that glistened in the sun, jewels that sparkled as if lit from within. Yet there was no shop, no merchant, no trade she was known to run. Yet amid all this luxury, she allowed no one close to her. She was a mystery, a puzzle no one dared to solve, until one maid, young, curious, and unknowingly brave, arrived to serve her. The maid was new to the village, and knew nothing of the dark tales that surrounded her employer. For her, the rich woman was simply a beautiful, wealthy woman who lived in an enormous house, and paid well for discretion. And so, the maid began her work, dusting the rooms of the mansion, scrubbing the floors, and keeping to herself. But as time went on, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that crept into her bones. There were rules in the house, ones that made little sense. The woman had forbidden her from entering certain rooms, from touching certain objects, from questioning certain sounds that echoed through the house at odd hours. And slowly, with each passing day, the maid began to notice things that didn't quite fit. Odd sounds echoed from deep within the house late at night, like the cracking of stone, or the whisper of something breaking free. And sometimes, she found faint traces left behind, small, pale shards that looked almost like eggshells, scattered near the door of a room she was warned never to enter. The maid was a young woman, new to the village, with wide, curious eyes and a quiet disposition. She had come seeking work, eager to earn her keep, and couldn't believe her fortune when the wealthy woman herself had offered her a place in the grand house. She had heard a few whispers about the strange mistress, but in her excitement, she dismissed them. After all, the house on the hill was beautiful, and the pay was generous. It seemed like a dream job, a rare chance to escape the hard, endless labor of farm life. The woman had only one request: discretion. She required a servant who wouldn't pry, wouldn't gossip, and wouldn't question her ways. The maid agreed readily. She had been raised to be respectful, to keep her head down, and she was eager to please. At first, everything seemed ordinary. She kept to her daily chores, tidying the rooms and sweeping the grand halls. But she was always careful to avoid the rooms her mistress had forbidden. The woman's voice, cold and stern, echoed in her memory every time she passed one of those doors. "Never enter this room," she had said, her tone leaving no room for questions. But as days turned to weeks, the maid couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this house than met the eye. It was little things at first, odd, unsettling details that she might have overlooked had she not spent so many hours in silence, surrounded by the vast, shadowy halls of the mansion. Sometimes, as she dusted the ornate shelves or polished the floors, she'd feel a prickling at the back of her neck, a sensation that made her look over her shoulder, certain she was being watched. But every time, she found herself alone. The empty corridors seemed to stretch on forever, and the silence was so complete that even the faintest sounds, the scuff of her broom, the rattle of a door in the wind, echoed ominously through the house. But the most unsettling discovery came one morning, while she was cleaning the main hall. As she swept near one of the forbidden doors, she noticed something strange on the floor, a tiny pale fragment, almost translucent, like a piece of eggshell. She bent down, examining it closely. It was delicate, so thin it looked like it might crumble at her touch, but there was something odd about it. The edges seemed to gleam faintly, as if dusted with a shimmer of gold. She glanced around, nervous, but there was no one in sight. Her mistress was out, as usual, off on one of her mysterious morning excursions. The maid picked up the fragment, examining it more closely. It looked like nothing she'd seen before. Who would leave an eggshell here? And why did it have that strange, almost unnatural gleam? She pocketed the fragment, deciding to put it out of her mind, but the questions lingered. In the days that followed, the woman's rules seemed to grow more ominous. The warnings about the forbidden room replayed in her head, mingling with rumors she'd overheard in the village. The older servants who worked in nearby houses occasionally muttered stories when they thought she wasn't listening. Whispers about strange occurrences in the house on the hill. They spoke of odd lights seen flickering in the windows late at night, and of strange visitors who came and went without ever speaking to anyone. And then there were the tales of other maids, servants who had come to work for the rich woman, but hadn't stayed long. Some had left without a word. Others had simply disappeared, never to be seen again. The maid tried to ignore the growing unease, but each day brought new questions. She began to wonder about the woman's wealth, why she lived alone, where her money came from, why she never seemed to age. And each day, the forbidden room seemed to call to her more strongly, as if something inside it wanted to be discovered. The smell lingered around the door, earthy, metallic, almost like blood. And now, every so often, she'd find those same tiny eggshell fragments scattered in the hallway, a silent reminder of the secrets that lay hidden within. As time went on, the maid noticed that her mistress kept an odd routine, one that grew stranger the more she observed it. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, the woman would leave the house wrapped in a dark cloak, her face set in a somber expression. She would walk down the path leading out of the village, disappearing into the mist, and wouldn't return until the late morning, often looking drained, yet oddly radiant, as though she'd performed some mysterious ritual. She never explained these excursions, and grew cold and distant whenever the maid asked where she had been. There were other odd habits, too. The woman would spend hours in front of her mirror, gazing at her own reflection with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She would trace her own features, as if memorizing them, her fingers lingering on her sharp cheekbones and colorless lips. Sometimes, as the maid passed by the door, she'd hear her mistress murmuring softly to herself, a strange, rhythmic chant that sent chills down her spine. It sounded almost like a conversation, as if she were speaking with someone unseen, though no one else was ever in the room. Once, while dusting her mistress's chamber, the maid noticed strange objects scattered on the vanity table. A series of small, delicate glass bottles filled with odd powders and liquids, some in dark red and others in glittering gold. There was also an ornate silver bowl containing what looked like fine silvery dust. Her mistress never allowed her to touch these objects, and she had warned the maid sternly never to disturb them. Yet the maid couldn't help but wonder about their purpose. especially since her mistress seemed to be aging in reverse, her skin as flawless and pale as polished marble. The maid's curiosity grew each day, fueled by small, unsettling discoveries. Sometimes, when she went to wash her mistress's linens, she found tiny stains on the sheets, small dark spots that looked almost like dried blood. She wondered if her mistress was ill, yet she never appeared weak or frail. Quite the opposite, in fact. Each morning she seemed to return with an unearthly glow, as if her vitality were being renewed by some hidden force. Then there were the sounds. Late at night, when the house was silent and all the lights were dimmed, the maid would lie awake in her small room, listening. And from deep within the house, echoing through the walls, she would hear faint, unsettling noises. Sometimes it was a soft rustling, like leaves brushing against a window pane. Other times it was a sharp crack, like a stone splitting in two, or the unmistakable sound of something fragile breaking. And always, just before the sound stopped, there was a faint, almost inaudible whisper, as though someone, or something, was speaking in a language the maid couldn't understand. The forbidden room weighed heavily on her mind, like an itch she couldn't scratch. Every day, as she walked past the door, her eyes would linger on it, drawn by an inexplicable pull. She tried to resist, but the room seemed to call to her, promising answers to all the questions that gnawed at her. The strange smells, the earthy metallic scent, mixed with the faint hint of decay, seemed to seep through the cracks in the door, curling into the air around her. She could almost feel something on the other side, something alive and waiting. One evening, unable to resist her curiosity any longer, she finally gathered the courage to ask her mistress about the room. She approached her cautiously, choosing her words carefully. "Madam," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "there is a smell near the room at the end of the hall. I was wondering if perhaps something was broken, or if there's anything you need me to tend to." The woman's reaction was immediate and fierce. Her eyes narrowed, and she fixed the maid with a cold, piercing stare. "I have told you never to enter that room," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Do not ask questions about things that do not concern you." Her tone was sharper than the maid had ever heard, and for a brief, terrifying moment, her face twisted into something that barely resembled her usual beauty. There was a flash of something dark and hungry in her gaze, something that made the maid's blood run cold. The maid nodded, retreating hastily, but her mind was ablaze with questions. What was her mistress hiding in that room? What could cause such a visceral reaction, such fierce protectiveness over a single locked door? And why did her mistress always return from her morning excursions with that unsettling glow, as if she were feeding off something no one else could see? In the following days, the maid's curiosity only grew despite her fear. She began to wonder if the villagers' tales held some truth. Perhaps there was something supernatural about her mistress's wealth, something dark and unholy. And perhaps, just perhaps, the answers she sought lay behind that forbidden door, waiting for her to discover them. The maid's fear of her mistress should have kept her curiosity in check, but each day she felt more compelled to know the truth. It was as if the forbidden room itself was calling her, tempting her to break her vow of obedience. Her nights were filled with restless dreams, dark and tangled visions that seemed almost too real. In these dreams, she would find herself standing before the forbidden door, her hand reaching out to touch the cold metal handle. She could feel something stirring within, a faint heartbeat pulsing in time with her own. She would wake up each morning drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, and the lingering scent of earth and blood in her nostrils, as if the dream had followed her out of sleep. The villagers noticed her distracted state and began to whisper. As the maid ran errands through the village, she caught snippets of conversation, words that made her stomach twist with fear and doubt. "She won't last long," one woman murmured as she passed. "Just like the others," said another. The maid hadn't known that others had come before her, servants who had left without a trace. She found herself wondering where they had gone, why they had left. Were they driven out by the same sense of dread that was growing inside her? Or had something darker happened to them within the shadowy halls of the mansion? Late one afternoon, she returned from gathering firewood to find an old woman standing in the village square, watching her with knowing eyes. The old woman was wrinkled and stooped, her clothes patched and faded, yet her gaze was sharp and penetrating. As the maid passed, the old woman reached out a withered hand and caught her by the arm. "You work for the lady in the house on the hill, don't you?" she asked, her voice rough and low. The maid nodded, her heart pounding. The old woman leaned closer, her breath hot and sour against the maid's cheek. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice laced with warning. "There are secrets in that house, dark secrets that feed off the innocent. If you value your life, keep your head down and do not ask questions." The warning sent a chill down the maid's spine, yet it only served to heighten her curiosity. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind raced with questions. What secrets could her mistress be hiding? What did the old woman mean by feed off the innocent? Could it be that her mistress was involved in some dark magic, some unholy pact that bound her to her riches? The maid thought of the fragments of eggshell she'd found scattered near the forbidden door. She thought of her mistress's strange, ageless beauty, the small bloodstains on her sheets, the faint sounds that drifted through the walls late at night. There was a pattern there, she was sure of it, but the pieces refused to come together. Over the next few days, her mistress seemed to sense the maid's growing suspicion. She became more withdrawn, her eyes darting toward the maid with a wary, almost animalistic glint whenever they crossed paths. Once, the maid caught her muttering under her breath, her voice sharp and frantic. "It's too soon," she whispered to herself, her hands clenched tightly around the edge of a table. "I need more time. I need another." When she noticed the maid watching her, her face darkened, and she dismissed her sharply, her voice like ice. The maid tried to push these encounters from her mind, but the house itself seemed to conspire against her, feeding her curiosity with new, unsettling discoveries. One evening, as she was sweeping the hallway near the forbidden room, she found another shard of eggshell lying on the floor. This one was larger than the other she had found, with a strange pattern etched into its surface, fine lines that twisted and curled like veins. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands, feeling the faint warmth that pulsed from it, as though it were alive. A shiver ran through her, and she dropped the shard, watching as it rolled across the floor and settled near the forbidden door. The next morning, the maid's resolve finally broke. She decided that she would discover the truth, no matter the cost. She spent the day planning her approach, her nerves taut with fear and anticipation. She would wait until her mistress left for her morning excursion. Then she would enter the forbidden room and see for herself what lay hidden within. As the first light of dawn crept over the hills, her mistress slipped out of the house, her cloak pulled tight around her shoulders. The maid watched her from the window, her heart pounding as her mistress disappeared into the mist. She waited a few moments, her breath shallow, then crept down the hall toward the forbidden door. Her hands trembled as she reached for the handle, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. She hesitated, a voice in the back of her mind warning her to turn back, to leave the secrets buried and return to her simple life. But her curiosity was too strong, and before she could change her mind, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The smell hit her first, thick and cloying, a mixture of earth and decay, with a faint metallic tang that made her stomach churn. She stepped into the room, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the small, dust-covered window. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with odd trinkets, strange herbs, dried animal bones, jars filled with dark liquids that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. But what caught her attention was the floor, where a scattering of pale, broken eggshells lay, gleaming faintly in the half-light. She crouched down, her fingers hovering over one of the shells. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, shimmering with an unnatural glow, as if it held some forbidden power. Her gaze drifted to the center of the room, where a large, unbroken egg rested in a nest of golden straw. It was nearly the size of a melon, its shell smooth and polished, with veins of gold running through it like rivers. The sight of it was mesmerizing, beautiful and terrible all at once. She reached out, unable to resist, her fingers brushing against the warm, pulsing surface. In that moment, she heard a sound behind her, a faint rustling, like the shifting of fabric. She froze, her heart pounding, and turned slowly, dreading what she might see. Her mistress stood in the doorway, her eyes dark and wild, her face twisted with fury. The maid's breath caught in her throat as she met her mistress's gaze. Gone was the refined, ethereal beauty she had always seen. Her mistress's face was twisted with a fury so intense that it bordered on madness. Her eyes, usually cold and calculating, burned with a fire that seemed almost inhuman. The room felt stifling, as though the very air had thickened with her rage. "How dare you?" her mistress hissed, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with venom. She stepped into the room, her movements smooth and predatory, her eyes never leaving the maid's. "Did I not warn you? Did I not make myself clear? This room is forbidden to you." Her voice rose, filling the small room, echoing off the shelves lined with strange, forbidden objects. The maid backed away, her heart racing, words failing her. She wanted to apologize, to explain that her curiosity had gotten the better of her, but her mistress's piercing glare silenced her. She could feel the weight of her mistress's rage pressing down on her, and she suddenly felt like a trapped animal, cornered and helpless. The woman's gaze shifted from the maid to the large, golden-veined egg at the center of the room, and a look of possessive fear flickered across her face. She reached out, her long, pale fingers brushing over the egg's surface with a gentleness that seemed out of place in her fury. "This is not something for your kind to touch," she whispered, her voice trembling with a strange mixture of reverence and terror. "You don't understand what you've disturbed." The maid swallowed, forcing herself to speak despite the terror gripping her. What is it?" she managed, her voice barely audible. Why do you keep these eggshells and this?" She gestured to the large egg, unable to find the words to describe its unnatural beauty. Her mistress's face twisted into a cruel smile, her eyes gleaming with a dark, unholy light. "You want to know, do you? You want to understand the price of wealth, of beauty, of immortality?" Her voice was mocking, filled with a bitter edge. She stepped closer to the maid, who instinctively shrank back, but there was no escape. The door was blocked by her mistress's imposing figure. "Very well," the woman said, her voice low and dangerous. "Since you've gone this far, I suppose you deserve to know. But remember, knowledge has a price." She leaned in, her eyes glittering with a predatory gleam. "I am not like you, child. I am bound to this world by forces older and darker than you can imagine. My wealth, my beauty, my life itself, they are all sustained by a pact that requires sacrifices." The maid's eyes widened, horror creeping into her heart as the implications of her mistress's words sank in. "Sacrifices?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Her mistress's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed sharper, more predatory than they had moments before. "Yes," she purred. "These eggs are not mere trinkets. They are the vessels of my power, born from my own flesh. Each one holds a fragment of my essence, a piece of my soul. And each time I lay one," she spat the words with a strange mixture of pride and disgust, "it grants me wealth, beauty, and the life I am owed." The maid's stomach twisted in revulsion. She looked at the broken shells scattered across the floor, her mind reeling as she began to understand. Her mistress wasn't simply a rich woman with dark secrets. She was something else entirely, something ancient and unnatural. A creature bound by a dark ritual that fed on her own flesh and blood. The eggs were her wealth, her sustenance, her very life force. And the room they were kept in was like a shrine to her twisted, unnatural existence. But why me?" the maid stammered, her voice trembling as she tried to make sense of it all. "Why did you bring me here?" The woman laughed, a sound that was cold and devoid of warmth. "Ah, that is the question, isn't it?" she said, her voice dripping with cruel amusement. "I need more than eggs to sustain me. I need the energy of life, the essence of the innocent, to replenish what the ritual takes from me. You, my dear, are young, strong, pure. You are exactly the kind of soul that will keep my power alive for years to come." The realization struck the maid like a blow. She was not here to serve, to work, or even to befriend the woman. She was here to be used, to be drained, to become yet another sacrifice in her mistress's endless cycle of dark magic. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and fear like she had never known gripped her heart. She was nothing more than a lamb brought to the slaughter. "No," she whispered, backing away, her voice thick with terror. "No, please. I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The woman's smile twisted into something cruel and triumphant. "It's far too late for apologies, child. You've seen too much, and you know too much. I cannot allow you to leave now, not with my secrets." The maid's back hit the wall, and she realized with a sickening dread that there was nowhere left to run. Her mistress stepped forward, her shadow stretching long and dark across the room, her face contorted with a hunger that was both ancient and insatiable. In that moment, the maid understood that she was not facing a human being, but something far older, something that fed on innocence and thrived in darkness. But just as her mistress reached for her, something within the maid snapped. Fueled by desperation, she grabbed a broken piece of eggshell from the floor, clutching it like a weapon. The golden veins pulsed beneath her fingers, filling her with a strange warmth, a spark of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "Stay back!" she cried, her voice strong and defiant. For a moment, her mistress hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the shell in the maid's hand. "You foolish girl," she hissed. "Do you think that piece of me can save you?" But the maid noticed something. Her mistress's gaze was fixed on the eggshell, a flicker of fear lurking behind her anger. The maid didn't know why, but she felt that the shell held a power of its own, a remnant of her mistress's essence that perhaps could be turned against her. Summoning every ounce of courage, she tightened her grip on the shell and took a step forward. "I don't know what this is, but if it's part of you, then maybe it can destroy you," she said, her voice steady despite the terror thrumming through her veins. Her mistress snarled, baring her teeth, and for a moment, they stared each other down, predator and prey, locked in a battle of wills. The room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Then, with a shriek of rage, her mistress lunged, her fingers curled like claws, reaching for the maid's throat. But the maid was ready. She thrust the eggshell forward, pressing it against her mistress's chest, and a blinding light erupted from the shell, filling the room with a searing brightness that burned the woman's flesh. Her mistress screamed, a sound so raw and primal that it seemed to shake the foundations of the house. The light from the eggshell pulsed, growing brighter, hotter, as the maid pressed it harder against her mistress's skin. Her form began to writhe and twist, her beautiful face contorting as the power of her own essence turned against her. "Stop!" her mistress shrieked, her voice cracking. "You don't know what you're doing." But the maid held firm, feeling the warmth from the eggshell surge through her, filling her with strength and determination. She pressed harder, watching as her mistress's skin began to crack, fragments of her flawless beauty breaking away to reveal the monstrous form beneath. With one final scream, her mistress collapsed to the floor, her body dissolving into ashen shadows, leaving only the shattered fragments of eggshells scattered around the room. The maid fell back, breathing heavily, her hands trembling as she took in the scene before her. Her mistress was gone, reduced to nothing but dust and broken shells, the remnants of her dark power lying scattered around the room. The silence that followed was thick, pressing in from all sides as the maid struggled to steady her breathing. Her mistress was gone, and yet the room still felt heavy, haunted by the remnants of a dark power that lingered like smoke. She took a shaky step back, her heart pounding, afraid that at any moment, the shadows might rise and come for her. But nothing stirred. The house, which had once seemed alive with secrets and mysteries, now felt hollow, empty.